Hello, if you're new here, my name is Kira. Welcome to my channel. Today I want to show you my wonderful recipe for how to make gluten-free sourdough bread that tastes absolutely perfect and amazing every single time. I have had celiac disease for about 15 years, and when I started looking for a gluten-free sourdough recipe, I could not find anything that was using a one-to-one recipe that included some things that I already had in my kitchen. So I'm so happy to have created this recipe and really excited to share it with all of you. So grab a pen and follow along. The first thing you want to do is grab your mixing bowl, and in my mixing bowl, I'm going to make sure that I always zero it out and am measuring in grams. It keeps the recipe much simpler. The very first step is to add 330 grams of room temperature or even lukewarm water. I add it here as I'm looking at my son, who most definitely wants to be in the video with me. Make sure you're taking notes. I'm sorry that I'm not a blogger and I don't have it all written out for you, but this way you can follow along right with me. Now, keep in mind, this is gluten-free bread. It's not going to be just as simple as sourdough, flour, water, salt. Gluten-free breads, I have tried those recipes and they just do not turn out as intended. So next, I'm going to zero it out again and add 20 grams of olive oil to my bowl. We're adding all of our liquid ingredients first, and I will explain why in just a minute. After that, grab your maple syrup, zero it out again, and nice and simple, 20 grams of maple syrup. This recipe seems to be very straightforward, and I've actually, after making it multiple times a week, I've just kind of memorized how much of what goes into it at this point. Next, you want to grab your psyllium husk, or silly musk, as my 4-year-old likes to call it, and add 20 grams of it to your liquids.
Silly musk.
Once you have added your 20 grams to it, you're going to go ahead and grab a whisk and start whisking. If you add your psyllium husk first and then the liquids after, it will clump and the clumps will be much more difficult to break up. So I definitely recommend adding your liquids first, then adding your 20 grams of psyllium husk, and then whisking. I'll give you a close-up view here of what you want it to look like while you're whisking. You want to make sure you remove all of the clumps from it and continue whisking until everything seems completely incorporated. It might take a minute or two to get to that state, and once you have it completely whisked together, it will begin to form into a gel-like substance. So this is why we do it first, so we can sit it to the side, let it form into its gel, and then we'll come back to it later. So you whisk it all up, and then I usually just tap my whisk off and set it aside, or sometimes even leave it in the bowl so that I can use it to scrape it out of the bowl later, and we'll just sit the entire thing off to the side. Now we're going to move on to our dry ingredients while that forms its gel. So grab your KitchenAid mixing bowl. You could attempt to make this recipe without a KitchenAid. I have never done so. It would probably require a lot of whisking, but if you try it, let me know how it works out. But I always go to my trusty stand mixer, use my bowl right on my scale, zero it out, and add 340 grams of all-purpose flour. This is the important part. I use 1-to-1 King Arthur's gluten-free flour. I do not mix 10 different flours together and starches together and make it really complicated. I just go to my local store, buy King Arthur's flour, and go from there. It's an easy way to make gluten-free bread without having to have tons of fancy ingredients in your home. After you've added all of your flour, you will set it aside because we'll come back to that in a little bit, and grab some salt. If you like your bread on the saltier side, you're going to add 10 to 12 grams of salt to it at this point. And if you like it a little less salty, sometimes I will only add 8 grams of salt to my recipe. Your wrist will likely be hurting at this point if you are using a salt grinder like I am. Go ahead and set your salt aside after that and grab your baking powder. Now, yes, baking powder is not something usually found in a sourdough bread, but like I said before, this is gluten-free bread. It does not act the same way whatsoever as bread that has gluten in it. So we will add 5 grams of baking powder, and I use an aluminum-free baking powder, and just a smidge really makes a difference. Now here you'll see me mixing all of that up with a spoon. I'm fairly minimalistic and only own one whisk, but if you have another whisk or if you want to clean off your other whisk, this is the time to use it. If you're using a spoon, you'll need to make sure that you're breaking up all of the clumps of the baking powder and getting it totally incorporated with the salt and flour, or the clumps will be in your bread. Hindsight, I really should have used at least a fork. That might have made my life a little bit easier, but sometimes the spoon is all I have for measuring and I just make do with it. So once we have all of those dry ingredients mixed together, you're going to go ahead and get out your starter. This is the exciting part. I'm assuming if you're here, you already have a well-established gluten-free starter. It seems to be that there are tons of tutorials on how to make one very similarly to a starter that has gluten in it, but this one was just made with a gluten-free flour. Here are some clips of what a very happy, healthy starter looks like. I will be honest, I typically always feed my starter the same, but sometimes it is a little more liquidy than others because I'm eyeballing them and how much water that I'm adding. So keep that in mind later in your recipe. If your starter seems to be a little more runny, it might mean that later on you will need to add less water to it. But here's a beautiful clip of what your starter should look like after it has been fed earlier in the day or the night before and is ready to bake with. Make sure when you are using anything to mix your starter, you're cleaning all of those utensils right after, or you will end up with a very, very sticky, hardened mess. So grab that starter and add 265 grams of starter to the flour that you have measured out before. Now, I do use a scale while I'm baking my sourdough bread, but I am not absolutely perfect on my ingredients. Sometimes a little bit too much, and sometimes I have a little bit under of what exactly it calls for. I just try to get things as close to possible, and I found that as long as you're keeping an eye on it and know what you're doing, really it turns out fine every time. So keep an eye on it at around 265 grams of your starter. And at this point, if you plan on using it for something else, remember to feed it and set it aside. After you have added your starter, you're going to add just a smidge more water. Now, at this point, I usually add about 90 grams of water or 100 grams of water. Starting with less is actually better because then you know you're not going to overdo it. Adding a little bit of extra water, make sure that it stays just the wetness that you'd like. Here we will add in what was left of the psyllium husk mixture, scraping out the bowl afterwards so that we get all of it in there. And onto the stand mixer. I attach my dough hook, turn it on about a medium speed, and let it do its thing for probably 2 or 3 minutes. You'll notice that everything starts to get incorporated pretty well, but at some point you will find that a lot of flour is sticking to the sides or to the bottom of the bowl. And this is when I turn it off after a couple minutes, pull it out, and use a spatula or something else to scrape down the sides, flip it over so that the flour can get better incorporated into it, and then I put it back on. Now this is where that 90 to 100 grams really plays an important part. You need to look at your dough at this point. You want your dough to look like it is sticky, but not overly wet. If you add too much water, it will be very hard to work with. This is why I usually start with that 90 grams and will add just a smidge more as I'm watching it. You want your dough to look exactly like this. It should be all well incorporated. It's not going to be as stretchy as a regular dough, but it won't be very sticky either. Now you see me taking off my rings so that I don't get a bunch of gunk into them and getting out my banneton baskets. I will flour them because today I'm actually making 2 loaves. Sometimes I have made a double loaf where I just double this entire recipe and put it all into one basket, but today I am gifting someone a loaf, so I'm going to make one, probably turn off my video, make another one, and we will bake them together. So flour your surface. This is right after I have mixed it all up in my stand mixer. And scoop your dough right out onto your floured surface. You can see the consistency here. It is not too sticky. If you have too much water, you will know because it will be way too sticky. I'm going to get my hands nice and floured and pat it out gently. Once you've patted it out gently, I tuck in the sides just a smidge and we'll put it right into the bantam basket. You can put it in a lined basket or you can put it in a basket without the liner. I actually take the liner most of the time and slide the liner over the top of my basket to make sure that I'm keeping everything clean and draft free. So here you'll see me just plop it right down into the basket and put the liner right on top of it. I tend to try to mess with it too much. Definitely not necessary to mess with it because we will do some work on it later right before we bake. Once you have the liner on it, you will go ahead over to a warm place, somewhere draft free. I typically go to my oven and turn on the oven light. The oven light tends to keep it just warm enough to rise and be happy. So once I have it turned on, I put them right underneath of it to start rising. And this is where it gets exciting. I've got both of them in there and I will come back in 6 hours. I know everyone has different lengths of time they tend to go for, but 6 hours seems to be the perfect amount of time. At this point, if you don't think you're going to be baking, I would just plop them in the fridge for up to 48 hours and pull them back out when you're ready. But as you can see, they have both risen a bunch. They look nice and fluffy and they are ready to bake. I will next begin with the preheating the oven. So I take a pot and fill it with water. I use this cast iron. My husband would like everybody to know that if you are going to use this cast iron and not actually oil it after, it will rust. Not speaking from experience or anything. So if you have a stainless steel pot, it might be a better idea. But fill it with water and you're going to use this to create a steam in your oven. So I will put this in before I preheat my oven. I preheat my oven to 425 degrees, add in the water, and add in my Dutch oven. Depending on your oven, obviously will depend on how long it will take all of those to reach temperature. Mine usually takes about 20 minutes to get up to temp and creates a nice steamy place in there. So here I'm going to give you a few options as to what to do when it comes time to bake. You can do option 1, which is just plop it right out of your bantam basket, give it a tiny little scoot under, and grab something to score it with. You score it so that it doesn't just burst in random spots. You can use a knife very easily if you don't have any special fancy tools for it. You will also want to sit it on either parchment paper or a bread sling like I have. Parchment paper works just fine. Again, nothing super fancy, just so that it doesn't stick to the bottom of your Dutch oven. So once your Dutch oven is preheated, you will open it up, take off your lid and plop it in. You can see here that this bread loaf is on the flatter side because I have not messed with it much. I really don't mind how flat a bread tends to be, so I typically do this recipe without adding any extra steps into it because it's just much simpler and straightforward. However, I'll show you just a little bit here, another option, so that you can have your bread rise a little bit more instead of having a flat bread. You will set your timer to 40 minutes. If you'd like your bread to be a little extra crispy, then you'll set it to 45 minutes. Once the 40 minutes is up, all you do is take off your lid. You have a beautiful loaf baking in there. Slide it back in and set your timer for another 40 minutes. Again, if you would like it to be on the crispier side, I will do 45 minutes and 45. A lot of times, to be honest, I set it for 40, and by the time I get up from wherever I am and go find it, it's been 42, 43 minutes. So here I will pull out the beautiful loaf. You can see all of the lines on it from the basket. If you wanted to be fancy, you could do a nice score on it. I am dumping out my second loaf for the day. Again, also not going to do much with this one other than gently tuck it under and close up any big gaps so it doesn't split. I will show you how to make it into a nice ball here in a moment so that you can get it to rise even more. But I will take off my lid, plop it in because I already have my oven preheated, and same thing, bake this one for another 40 minutes, just like before, 40 to 45, again, depending on how crispy you like it. The important thing is after you've baked your bread, you want to take it out and sit it on a cooling rack like you can see here in the background. And once you put it on your cooling rack, you want it to sit without cutting into it until it is completely cooled. That usually takes at least 3 to 4 hours to completely cool. And completely cooling it will help ensure that all of the insides are baked fully as well. So here after 40 minutes, I'm going to take my lid off of my second loaf, scoot it back in, and set my timer for another 40 to 45 minutes, and then it will be done. And a beautiful loaf. Again, scoring is not my thing. If you want to learn how to do very fancy scoring patterns, you are more than welcome to. But I will show you exactly what this bread looks like here. I will cut it open, and you will see that every single time and time again, it always produces a beautifully fluffy, crispy on the outside, gluten-free sourdough loaf, and it tastes delicious. No bread that I've ever bought from the store that is gluten-free would do that. So I'm kind of hooked on making my own. So let me show you the second option as to what to do if you want something a little more involved and to get a lot more rise out of it. After you've risen your bread, you're going to then oil your hands up. This will make it much easier to manipulate. Take your dough out of your Banneton basket and start kneading. You're going to knead it until all of that flour from the Banneton basket is incorporated and the entire loaf starts to become a little more wet. You'll be able to tell because it's not going to break whenever you're pushing on it. So push on it, gently knead it, then you're going to form it into a ball. So you will flatten it out, probably put a little more oil on your hands, that way it won't stick. You will flatten it out, start folding in the edges and forming it into a nice small ball. That is what gives it the extra rise compared to before, is before I just dumped it and it had rested kind of flat in the Banneton. If I did a double loaf, it probably would not have turned out quite so flat, but like I said, really don't mind it being a bit of a skinnier loaf. So here you can see the difference of this same amount of dough has produced a much smaller, tighter ball. This is when you want to score it again. I sometimes like to pretend that I know how to do fancy things when it comes to scoring sourdough, and I absolutely do not. So I will flour it and I will score it. And to me, scoring it and how it turns out, sometimes it's fun and sometimes it's a big flop. But the taste of the bread is the most important to me, and the texture. So you'll see me trying to put a little fancy design into it, and later on you will see that nothing showed up from it. But on the side, you want to score it nice and big so that when it's in the oven and it rises, it has somewhere to go and it won't just burst anywhere at least. So I do one big score down the side. Most people, if you want to stay with a traditional X, that's the easiest. A little X right in the top works perfectly fine. But I will score it down the side, and then right in the center, you can try a little design. And if you're better at it than I am, then something beautiful will turn out for you. People make beautiful loaves, and I have yet to figure out how. The X seems to be my best friend nowadays. Plop it in the oven just like before. I preheated to 425 with some water and bake it covered. Then you take off the lid. This one's already halfway done. Put it back in, do another 40 to 45 minutes, and you will see the difference here in the rise of the loaf. Set it on your cooling rack to cool, and again, do not touch it, do not cut it. It is so tempting, but leave it alone for at least 3 or 4 hours to completely cool before you cut it. This recipe is tried and true. If you have stuck around this long, thank you. Make sure you save the video, and that way you will be able to come back and make your own loaves again. But time and time again, this has produced beautiful loaves. and I am so happy to be sharing this recipe with you today. Try it out and let me know in the comments how it works out for you.